Namaskar, Annyeonghaseyo. Welcome back to day 9 of our workshop on Facets of Modern India, a truly masterclass of ideas of India, I must say, by top class, best and brightest minds from India. I'm especially delighted to share that Swami Vivekanand Cultural Center at the Embassy of India in Seoul, under the dynamic leadership of our ambassador, Her Excellency Sri Priya Ranganathan and her team, has been a pioneer, in fact, a first in starting this truly intellectual enterprise. The sole mission is to develop a rich and nuanced understanding of modern India, the civilization, the state, in all its diverse manifestations amongst audiences abroad that always wanted to know more and more about India. Since day one of this workshop, we had a series of brainstorming sessions with an excellent galaxy of speakers, all leading in their own domain to give you glimpses of modern India on this virtual platform. We started the workshop on 1st of September with the inaugural address by President of Indian Council of Cultural Relations, Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe, on the idea of India. Subsequent lectures were by Professor Makarand Paranjape, Professor Rishikesh Senapati, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Ms. Indrani Bagchi, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, Ambassador Shyam Saran, and Ambassador Amandeep Gill on issues related to Indian philosophy, education policy, economy, media, foreign policy, and India's strategic culture, disarmament, and international security. All the lectures are on our social media handles, and you can go back to them for any future reference. I'm extremely honored to have amongst us one of the finest mind and expert, Mr. Kamal Kishore, who specializes in disaster and climate risk management issues, joining us here live from New Delhi. We look forward to his special lecture on disaster risk mitigation, the Indian perspective. With these words, may I now call upon Mr. Kamal Kishore to give his address. But let me also introduce him before we open the, we give over the floor to him. Mr. Kamal Kishore is a member of National Disaster Management Authority and has worked on disaster risk reduction and recovery issues for over 22 years at the local, national, regional, and global levels. Prior to joining the National Disaster Management Authority, he worked with the United Nations Development Programme for nearly 13 years in New Delhi, Geneva, and New York. At UNDP headquarters, he led global advocacy campaigns to address disaster risk reduction concerns in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the post-2015 development agenda. As program advisor, he also led the development of disaster and climate risk management related elements of the UNDP strategic plan 2014 to 2017. Previously, as UNDP's regional advisor for South and Southwest Asia, he supported more than 10 countries on a range of public policy and institutional development issues, while also advising them on the use of appropriate risk reduction tools and methodologies. He has supported post-disaster recovery through strategic advice, needs assessments, program development, and coordination after major disasters in Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Iran, Myanmar, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka. Given his wealth of experience with regard to disaster mitigation and climate risk reduction and his global advocacy campaigns, we thought no one but Mr. Kamal Kishore would be the right person to interact at this global platform to discuss more about these challenges and global responses to it. Let us hear to your special lecture on disaster risk mitigation, the Indian perspective. We also look forward to your views on global disaster situation and the Indian scenario. It is indeed a privilege to welcome you once again and look forward to your insightful address. Over to you, Mr. Kumar.
Thank you very much. I am indeed very honored to be here and I have this opportunity to discuss some ideas on disaster risk management from an Indian perspective. This is a particularly important time to be talking about disasters and disaster risk management when the entire world is facing what is called a black swan event, or an event which happens with very low frequency, but the impact is very high, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. There is no country in the world which has been left untouched by it. So it's a very topical issue to discuss disaster risk management today. There are also other disasters happening while we have COVID-19. In India, we've had really big floods this year. This has been a difficult flood season as well. Other parts of the world is also seeing cyclones and hurricanes, floods. So it's a very important time. It's a very pertinent issue to be discussing in the current global scenario. Okay, so I will talk about disaster risk management from the Indian perspective. I will briefly talk about what's happening in the globe, because in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world, we cannot look at disaster issues in isolation. We have to look at what is happening in the globe, what's happening in India, what are some of our achievements in recent years, what are some outstanding challenges. I will highlight some of the successes and some areas where we're pursuing international cooperation, where particularly the cooperation with your country would be something we would be looking to. So I want to start by showing one statistic, one slide, which basically where I have looked at last approximately 50 years and looked at what is the trend of disasters around the world. This is just the number of disasters. And there is a threshold which is applied here. So a disaster is counted in this data set only after it reaches a level where more than 9 people have lost their lives or more than 99 have been affected. So then it classifies as a disaster. What is very interesting to see is that weather and climate related disasters in this particular slide, which is floods and storms, there is a very clear trend that these are going up. Whereas geophysical disasters, in this particular case, earthquakes, are more or less flat. The number of earthquakes that have caused a damage above 9 lives lost and 99 people affected is more or less flat over the last 50 years, despite the fact that we have more people living in earthquake-prone areas now. So what it shows is that there is something definitely changing in terms of impact of weather and climate-related disasters, whether it is strong winds, whether it is too much water, too little water, and so on. Now, why is this happening? Perhaps it is happening because of climate change. In many parts of the world, there is clear signal that some parts, the extreme rainfall events are increasing. In some parts, the higher intensity cyclones and hurricanes are also increasing. But equally, perhaps more people now are living in the flood-prone areas. Perhaps more people are now living in the coastal areas. So in coastal areas in many countries in the world, the rate of population growth is 3 times that of the inland areas. So there are more people living in the way of the hazards. As a result, more hazards are getting converted into disasters where people lose their lives and get affected. So that there is a clear trend, and that is something we have to focus on. Now, this is a graph for, again, 50 years, where I have looked at the impacts. The previous one was looking at numbers. Here it's looking at all disasters and impacts in terms of deaths and economic losses. Now, of course, I have to quickly highlight that this analysis was it covers the time period up to 2015-16. So this does 16 to it does not take into account the current pandemic. So if we had a the current pandemic included in this, you will see a spike on the right side of both the graphs, which will be exceptionally high. So if we look at pandemic as a black swan event and leave that out, then what is very clear is that the number of deaths, mortality is gradually going down, mortality from disasters. So if you look at the first graph on the left, you see that a lot of big disasters happened in 60s and 70s, very high peaks. We still have big disasters in the 21st century, but the peaks are not that high. Of course, COVID-19 is an exception to this. But if we take COVID-19 out, there is a trend of decreasing mortality. But when we look at economic losses, it's very clear that economic losses are escalating very rapidly. Now, what does it mean? It means that perhaps we are doing a better job of saving lives, at least from floods and cyclones type of, forecastable events, but we are not doing a very good job of saving livelihoods. So we have to go beyond saving lives to also saving livelihoods. We can't be satisfied by just saving lives. And of course, COVID-19 will throw a whole range of new dimensions into the mix. Now, I would like to turn to the Indian situation. I just want to, this is a plot of just 1 year. 2015 was a bad year. There was a major earthquake in Nepal as well. So I took that year, which was where a lot of disasters have happened. And these are, so red disasters are geophysical, you have meteorological disasters, green dots, and you have hydrological events, and you have climatological events. And the size of the dot indicates the level of losses. Now, out in 2015, out of 1,060 events that were recorded in the global databases, this is analysis taken from Munich Re, which is a reinsurance company. Nearly 10% happen in India. So a very large proportion of disasters happen in India. So 10% of the global disasters this is a particular year of 2015, but similar trend can be seen in other years as well. Now let's look at some other dimensions. So if we just look at the expected direct average annual losses, and this is not an extreme year. This is not an extreme year where a big event have happened. If you look at a long-term average and see what is the average of average loss, a direct loss, the indirect loss. So for example, if a bridge is broken, there is this particular analysis looks at the direct cost of replacing that bridge. It does not take into account the secondary order impact, which is in terms of your productivity losses and so on. So just the direct losses are $10 billion per year, which is a very, very large sum. And these losses are not distributed evenly. Generally, the poor and the most vulnerable people are affected disproportionately. So even if the stock, the total of losses suffered by the poor is small, as a proportion of their annual income, it can be quite significant. It can trap people into poverty if they are exposed to disasters year after year. Also, there are a number of global analyses which put India in various categories, and invariably, irrespective of which agency, which academic institution is doing the analysis, we are at least in the top 15, 20 high-risk countries. This is a analysis done by Maplecroft that I have cited, where we are in top 4 in terms of absolute economic exposure to natural hazards. So the essence of what I'm trying to say is that we have a very high level of risk. Now, why are we at a high level of disaster risk? Basically, there are 3 elements to it. Almost all principal natural hazards occur in India. We have earthquakes. 58% of the country's land mass is earthquake prone. Moderate to severe magnitude earthquakes can occur there. About 13% of the country is exposed to floods. We have a coastline of more than 7,000 kilometers. Out of 7,000, in 5,000 kilometers, we expect that cyclones would make a landfall every few years. And on the East Coast, they tend to happen more often and more intense. Out of more than 700 districts, nearly 200 districts are prone to droughts. Landslides. Landslides occur in India in the 10 mountain states, but they also occur, and union territories, but they also occur down south in highlands of Kerala, for example. So if you added up all the landslides are rather localized, but if you added all the landslide prone areas in the country, the total geographical area will be close to the geographical area of a country like Norway. So as proportion of the whole country, it may look small, but actually it is very significant. So we have all hazards. In fact, we even have a volcano, which is dormant in the Andaman Nicobar Islands, and not many people live in the shadow of that volcano. So the point I'm trying to make is that we have all hazards. I have not listed here tsunami. We have tsunamis as well. We have snow avalanches. We have flash floods. We have, locust attacks, and we have glacial lake outburst floods. So these are what I put on the slide are just a few indicative ones, but we have many more hazards. If you count them, there would be more than 30 different kinds of hazards. Now, that is one part of the problem. The other is that we have very high exposure. A few minutes ago, I said that 58% of the country, or nearly 60% of the country, is prone to moderate to high level of earthquake risk. Earthquake hazard. But what is more concerning is that in that 60% or 58 to 60% land, 75% of our population lives. So 75% of the population is exposed to earthquakes or possibility of earthquakes of moderate to very high intensity. Same is the case with floods. I said that 13% of the population, 13% of the landmass is prone to floods, but way more than 13% people actually live in the country, in the flood-prone areas. Almost every year, up to 2 crore people, or 20 million people, are affected by floods in India. So very high exposure to hazards, and because we have large population, we can't talk about moving people away from the hazard-prone areas in a big way, because where are you going to move them? For example, in the northern state of Bihar, in a given year, you can have up to 10 million people affected directly by floods. It is not possible to move them. Where will you find additional land to move them? These things. So what we need to do is reduce their vulnerability, so that wherever they are protected by embankments, if that makes sense and it is feasible, or they build better houses, perhaps on stilts. Similarly, in earthquake-prone areas, we have to make houses which are stronger, which can withstand earthquakes. In 21st century, it is possible to build buildings which can withstand earthquakes of very high magnitude as well. So that is the third reason, that we also have a lot of inherent vulnerability in our built environment, because of buildings which cannot withstand earthquakes, because of socioeconomic systems and some environmental concerns that exacerbate risk. Having said that, so having painted this picture of difficulties, I also want to share some good news. The good news is that if you look at the last 20, 30 years or so, and if you look at, I'm sorry, in this the slide, it has got a little bit distorted, but you will get the essence of what I'm saying. In projection, it's getting distorted. In computer, it was okay. If you look at last 20 or 30 years, and for any given year, if you did an average loss analysis of mortality, so for example, if you're looking at mortality in year 1999, then you're looking at average mortality from 1990 to 1999, so that, you know, if there's a bad year, it gets sort of smoothened out. So 10-year moving average in terms of mortality peaked in India around 2005. Since then, we have been steadily reducing mortality from disasters. Of course, we also have been a little bit lucky that in this period where we are showing decline, events which are low frequency, high impact, such as earthquakes and tsunamis, have not occurred. And of course, now we are going through right now, just as we speak, another low frequency and high impact event, such as a global pandemic. So because that didn't happen till before the COVID-19, we could see a steady decline in mortality, particularly from weather and climate-related disasters. I would like to show you some specific successes. I will not talk about everything. So this is a comparison of two cyclones. It's a story of two cyclones, same state, same coastal area. There is a cyclone that occurred there was a cyclone that occurred in 1999 around this time. I think it was October of 1999, and nearly 10,000 lives were lost. And in 2013, we had a comparable cyclone about 14, 15 years later, and the mortality was in low 2 digits, 22. And it's not just that. The area that was evacuated in 1999, so if the cyclone is making landfall at point A, then 500-kilometer band, 250 kilometers north, 250 kilometers south, and then you draw a cone inside. So that's the number of, that's the area which was evacuated. In Filene, it was much smaller, 200 kilometers. Why? Because our confidence in the warning system was increased a great deal. So we were confident that we don't have to move people who are, you know, too far away from the forecasted point where the cyclone will enter the land. As a result, the money that we spent on evacuation during the events was also markedly different. You know, these are ballpark figures, 5,000 million rupees to 2,000 million rupees. So so all the investment that we made in 15 years in improving our early warning systems, we recovered them, first of all, by saving lives, and secondly, even saving money. So it paid for itself. All the investment that we made in improving early warning paid for itself in just one event. And 2013, I have to say, was not just a one-off event. You know, we also have had further events in 2014, 19, and 20, where the same kind of reduction in losses has been seen. Now, why did it happen? Why did we succeed there? Basically, there are 4 pillars of success. One, the first and foremost, is that we worked with communities. It was really a bottom-up process where communities were aware that what to do. They were organized. You know, there was coastal infrastructure to actually cyclone shelters where they could take shelter when the cyclone was approaching. Much better warning. You know, now we are able to forecast the landfall, the timing and place of landfall 5 days in advance. 5 days, a lot of time to evacuate and take actions for saving lives, and much more accurate forecast in terms of location as well. So specific warning as to where exactly the landfall will occur. So this is a success story of cyclones. I also want to talk a little bit about heat waves. So extreme temperatures are a big concern. This is a representative chart of how temperatures occur in India from April, May, and June. You can see the red is, above 42 degrees centigrades, 40 to 46, sometimes even 48 degrees centigrade. You can see that, our country gets really heated up in April, May, and June, starting in April. And by June, when the rains hit the southwest coast, then things begin to cool down. And this is the historical perspective on the loss of lives. So over 1992 to 2015, for about 23 years, we were losing very many lives in cyclones every year. And then you see more than 2,000 lives. And from 2015, because of a few things that we did with our meteorological department, we have reduced the loss of lives to a very low number. Although the last year was not so good, we still lost 226 people, but we've made enormous progress in reducing heat wave related deaths. 2020, 4 recorded deaths, but it's too early to say. It takes time to compile data and have a final number on that. How are we able to achieve that? Again, 4 pillars of success. One is taking science to people. So we were producing forecasts even before, but they were not reaching people in a format that they could understand, they could act upon. So I think that is one major effort, and we try to make the forecast very location specific. For example, 40 degree in the hills is very high temperature, and people don't have the adaptive response to be able to respond to that. 40 never even occurs. Actually, even 35 is very high. Whereas in a desert state, even 43, 44 is not very high. So what I'm trying to say in simple words is that the temperature, humidity, wind, persistence of high temperature for a number of days, the difference in daytime temperature and nighttime temperature, there are all, and the inherent resilience of people in a particular location. If people live in a hot and dry area, they are more adapted to those conditions. All of these factors have to be taken into account to come up with forecast which is specific to a place, which is something that people can act upon. The second thing we did was we launched a multi-sectorial response, not just looking at it as a disaster management or a public health problem, but also working with Ministry of Water, Ministry of Power, even Ministry of Labor. In heat wave months, we have worked with Ministry of Labor to ensure that during the forecasted days of heat conditions, no construction happens between 11 to 4. So the laborers the construction workers can start the work early, but they have to close it at 11, and 11 to 4 is a rest period. Drinking water is made available to them, and there is capacity in the hospitals to respond quickly when they see an incoming patient with signs of having affected by heat stroke. Similarly, reaching out to public with a lot of public information and partnership with local governments. So with that, we were able to dramatically reduce the loss of lives from heat waves. Now, these are just 2 examples. There are examples from other hazards as well, but I will move on to other thematic areas. One area which I think might resonate very well with our colleagues and friends in your country is the area of cultural heritage and disaster management. This is something we are taking very seriously, because this is an image not from India, but from Nepal, from 2015 earthquake, where the Archaeological Survey of India has been providing some support, working alongside our friends in Nepal to see how the cultural heritage sites damaged by the 2015 earthquake can be restored. So this is a very important area. Every year we hear of, there was a fire in Brazil some years ago where, enormous, incomparable civilizational heritage of the humanity was lost. So with some simple actions, we can actually reduce these losses to a very great extent. This is something which we are not doing just for our own country, but also for others. We have produced 2 guidelines which are recognized as global good practices, which were launched in 2017 at the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction. One is a set of national guidelines for disaster risk management in museums. Another one is national guidelines on disaster risk management in cultural heritage sites and precincts. We have started a program of international cooperation where with BIMSTEC countries, which is the Bay of Bengal region countries, we are working with response agencies. How do you do disaster response when a cultural heritage site is affected by a disaster in a sensitive manner so that you do not end up causing more damage through your response rather than avoiding that damage and preserving the heritage value of the site to the extent possible. So this is a big area of work. We have, the government of India has just set up a national disaster mitigation fund. And one of the things that will be, a national mitigation fund is a large fund with very many activities, but one of the things that we hope to advance is protection of cultural heritage sites from disasters. Now, it is very important, we cannot, not talk about the COVID-19 response. COVID-19 has impacted India in a big way. We have, as of today, more than 76,000 deaths, more than 4 million people, maybe 4.4, I think, 4.4 million people affected. So it's been a very, very difficult time last few months. But I want to sort of see the positive signs in it. One positive sign in it is that the recovery rate is very good. Out of 4.4 million people who've been tested positive, 3.5 million have recovered, they've been discharged. The active cases are less than 1 million. And mortality as a proportion of the overall population, as well as the proportion of those infected, is still hovering around 1.6, 1.7%. So mortality, so hospital management seems to be okay, although we need to improve and strengthen it much more. There is also something to be said about how we were able to scale up our capacities in terms of testing, and there the work that was done in South Korea in early days was very, very inspiring. Whether it's testing, whether it's the production of PPE kits or hospital beds, from conducting a few tens of tests to in multiples of 100,000s every day, we've come a long way. So it's going to be a long fight. No one can say that the fight has already been won, but we are at it, and we are confident that we will come out of it, and come out of it stronger, with a stronger understanding of how to deal with such a thing in the future. First of all, prevent such a pandemic. So from my organization side, NDMA, we've done a documentation which you can find on our website, which is a summary, a 50-page summary of the Indian experience on managing the COVID-19. It covers up to May, January to May. We will do another one, which will take us up to the end of September, to really capture lessons, so that, you know, a disaster is too precious to waste. You know, we really have to do everything we can to learn lessons from it. And there are some early lessons that I have listed here. One is that, you know, those of us who work on disasters, we know how to manage risk, but we have to get better at managing uncertainty. A lot of people working in this field have been expressing frustration that, you know, guidance keeps changing every few weeks. Well, it changes because we learn more. So there is uncertainty about it. There is still more is not known about this virus than is known. So we have to learn to live with uncertainty and deal with that. You know, there is this thing that prevention is better than cure, but here is a case where both prevention and cure need to go hand in hand. We have risk assessment, classic disaster risk management, risk assessment tools. We've tried to use them in COVID-19, but we have come against their limitations. We have to have more agile and granular risk assessment tools. We have to have much greater local level resilience. Communities have to be taken on board. And it really is something which requires a cross-disciplinary approach. So here are some early lessons from COVID. There are some overall challenges for India in terms of continuing challenges for disaster risk management. One is the risk of future disasters. You know, past is no longer a good guide for the future. So how do we do better scenario planning? The other is that how do we mainstream disaster risk reduction in development? I will talk about it in a few minutes. How do we make sure that every bridge, every hospital, every road, every airport that is made takes into account disaster risk and is built to last? We have to prevent economic losses, which are escalating rapidly. There is a lot of construction activity in the country. How do you do safe construction? We have strong institutions, but they have to be multi-layered. They have to go deeper. They have to be much more present at the local level. And of course, the involvement of communities is also something we need to take into account. So this is a repetition. In that context, I just want to talk a little bit about an initiative of Government of India and personally of Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi, which is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which was launched at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019. For the last 15-20 minutes, I've been talking about rising economic losses. If you looked at the last 10 years and you looked at where those losses are located, what accounts for those losses, you will see that most of the public sector losses, sometimes up to 67% or 2/3 of the losses, are concentrated in infrastructure sectors. Last year, the Indian coast, the east coast of India, coastal state of Odisha, was affected by Cyclone Fani. The mortality was in low 2 digits. It was a very severe cyclone. I think we did a very good job of saving lives. But when it comes to economic losses, $5 billion losses. And out of that, 40% of it was focused just on power infrastructure. And that is the direct losses. By not having power, the telecom systems get interrupted. When the telecom systems get interrupted, the ATM machines get interrupted. People don't have access to their own cash. So what happens to small businesses, people's livelihoods? That's in addition to 40% of 5 billion that I'm talking about. So protecting infrastructure, making sure that whatever we invest in infrastructure development for the future, not for years, but for decades, is built to last. It is built in a manner that it takes into account the current level of disaster risk, but also how disaster risks will be in the future, and build it in a manner that it's strong. So recognizing this and recognizing that countries are at different stages of infrastructure development, and countries also have different kinds of disasters, and we can all learn from each other. It's north, south, 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 north. There are countries that have huge infrastructure deficit, that are building a lot of infrastructure like us. There are countries that need to replace infrastructure, such as the United States, Japan, where the infrastructure is completing its life cycle. So there has to be, so our Prime Minister's vision is that there needs to be a global coalition on disaster resilient infrastructure. And he launched it officially on 23rd September 2019 at the UN Climate Action Summit. Since then, we've invited a number of countries to join the coalition, including South Korea. We have got confirmations, acceptance from 18 countries. We have very interesting mix of countries here. We have 9 or 10 G20 countries. We have landlocked countries, we have small island developing countries, we have middle income countries. So very, very interesting mix of countries that are replacing infrastructure, countries that are building new infrastructure. We also have 4 international organizations: the United Nations Development Program, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank are part of it. I hope we can add your country to this list as well sometime soon. We have started to work. The first governing council of the CDRI started back in 20th March. It is co-chaired currently by India and the United Kingdom at a very high level. The principal secretary to our Prime Minister, Dr. Mishra, Dr. Pramod Kumar Mishra, is the India's co-chair, and UK's Minister for Infrastructure is UK's co-chair. We have a very ambitious work plan for 3 years, which we are implementing. Government of India has put in $70 million for the next 5 years. And there are some initial commitments from UK, US, as well as multilateral institutions. I will not talk about all the initiatives, but there are 2 things that I will talk about. We have started with the International Civil Aviation Organization an effort to work on disaster resilience of airports. 2 global consultations have already been held. This will focus, there will be 4 parts to it. One, it will look at 150 airports across the world through a survey-based approach, and look at 20 airports through in-depth studies, then do some thematic studies. For example, what is the effect of land use planning or urban development on resilience of airports? And then it will look at the issues of finance. We also have a project which is looking at disaster resilience of infrastructure, power infrastructure, which we are working with the World Bank, the UK's DFID, which has a new name now, and our own Central Electric Authority. So these are just 2. There are other initiatives, knowledge development initiatives, such as a flagship report, which will come out in 2022, as well as a fellowship program, which will provide fellowship to researchers and innovators from CDRI member countries. The call has just been announced 1 week ago. This is the timeline after the launch. We've been doing a number of events. We do a global event every year. This year, we couldn't do it because of COVID. And G20 Summit, we will have some key outcomes delivered from this initiative, this thing. So we really hope that we'll have an opportunity to work with your country as well. So with that, I would like to conclude, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Kamal Kishore, for your fascinating lecture and your perspectives on disaster risk mitigation, global and Indian responses. Very aptly, you have summarized the global disaster situation and given a bird's eye view on the Indian scenario as well. You also highlighted about the factors leading to high-level disaster risks, such as hazards, exposures, and vulnerabilities of our environment and socioeconomic systems, and the progress made in mitigating it. You have also outlined the pillars of success, such as technical accuracy, better infrastructure, public information, people's participation, and partnership with local governments. You have also described the challenges thereof. One of the high points which I personally felt about your presentation was the focus on cultural heritage and disaster management, the good practices and guidelines on disaster risk management in museums and cultural heritage sites, and also the international cooperation that you are having with the BIMSTEC countries, and the recent response and the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. So these were fascinating, and I'm sure we got enough to learn from your presentation. And I'm sure the suggestions as given in your presentation, such as improvement in the institutional framework and reforms along with the involvement of the communities, will go a long run in improving the disaster-related scenario in India. It has been a great learning experience for all of us here, and I'm sure our participants must have got enough food for thought by your brilliant exposition. And we will invite the questions maybe meanwhile. I see a raised hand. Ms. Bahuguna, can you ask your question?
Thank you. It was an excellent presentation. Most of the issues have been sorted out. My only question is for prevention, can we have a system where urban planning and NDRF are very closely aligned? Because maximum disasters happen because of faulty urban planning. And can we have a system where punishment is so severe that nobody dares to kind of flout the rules? That's all. Thank you so much.
Deepal Mehta?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Hello, sir. My name is Deepal Mehta. I'm an Indian representative for Culture and Arts at the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism at the South Korean government. My question for you is, according to your information in the beginning of the lecture, the possibility of floods is really higher. And as we recently saw about the news about the floods in Assam and Orissa, I would like to know, like, what are your thoughts on developing a proper drainage system to control the flood-like situations in these regions or other regions as well?
Mr. Kishore, if you can just take these two questions and then we can begin.
So the first question is on integration with urban planning and penal provisions for flouting of rules. So I think that is something which is an ongoing struggle. We have a process by which now more and more master plans, for example, the National Institute of Urban Affairs is working on the new master plan of Delhi, and they, like, compared to 5 years ago, where disaster managers would go to the planners and say that, please, take our inputs. Now it's the other way around. There is a demand that, can you help us do a disaster risk management plan as an integral element of the urban plan as well. And at the same time, there's a lot of information becoming available on the whole issue of how do you do risk-sensitive urban planning. Delhi and Kolkata, for example, have seismic microzonations. There's an effort to do more than 30 cities microzonation. So we have more and more enabling conditions to make this happen. Now, your point on penal provision, I think if you look at the Disaster Management Act, there are enough penal provisions. Some of them have been used in the context of COVID-19 as well. So my own view is that, yes, maybe we can strengthen the penal provisions, but by just having strong penal provision doesn't mean that its implementation becomes very easy, because for implementation, you need a lot of people and capacity. What we need more is, rather than only penal provision, a social demand. So rather than saying that, somebody will come and check whether you're making your house earthquake resistant or not, people who are buying an apartment, or building a house, they should be demanding safety. There has to be a social demand for it, a social demand for reducing risk, building safely. So that's the answer to the first questioner. The second question is about floods. So on floods, there is a lot of work happening. I think similar to cyclones, I think our flood warning systems are improving, but it is taking time because in flood, there is one issue. You can forecast how high a river is flowing. So if you say that river X is flowing 5 centimeters above danger level, that's great. But that does not tell anybody who's living in a village. He wants to know, when the river flows 5 centimeters above danger level, which areas in his village get affected, get inundated, so that he can take preventive action. So how do we convert, like we've done for heat wave, how do we convert scientific forecast information into locally understandable, usable, and actionable information? That is the challenge, and it's something we are working on. And we can say that we're making some progress, but we have a long way to go.
Thank you. Could we request our ambassador, ma'am, if you are here, could you please give your remarks and respond?
Thank you so much, Sonu. Thank you so much to the member NDMA for a fantastic presentation. I truly learned a lot in the course of this in terms of what is the larger picture of India's overall disaster management landscape and the kind of challenges that we face. I mean, as a person from India, I've been, shall I say, aware of the kind of complications of and the kind of range of disasters that we have to contend with. But I think this would be, in a way, an eye-opener for our friends from Korea on what it is that we in Government of India have to deal with when we speak about the disaster management challenges as a whole. If I may request you, because I know that this is an area of particular interest to our friends in Korea, two questions really. One is, you have spoken at quite some length about the CDRI, what we see as being being its structure, its mandate, and so on. But if you could give us a sense of what is it that the Koreans can contribute, how will it be of value to Korean companies and Korean institutions, and how is it of value to the other members who are part of this platform? I think if we can get a sharper analysis of this from you, that would be really fantastic. And secondly, going beyond just the CDRI, for instance, when I speak to our colleagues in the Ministry of Environment, they told me, and this was something which came in a way as an eye-opener for me, that one of the areas where Korea has been very strong and very successful in the past many decades is in managing things like storm surges, managing erosion along the shoreline and so on. Are these areas, or are there other areas like this where you feel that there is more value in collaboration between the ROK agencies, Indian agencies, and other like-minded countries? So if I can take advantage of your presence and your expertise to just get a little bit more of insight into these two matters, I'd be very, very grateful. But on the whole, fantastic presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. So on the CDRI, specifically, what can be the sort of main areas of mutual benefit if ROK chooses to join CDRI? I see basically there are three very important areas where we can benefit from ROK's engagement. Number one is that a number of infrastructure systems are no longer limited to national boundaries. So infrastructures, in fact, I often use the term infrastructure systems as opposed to just infrastructure, because if you're talking about aviation infrastructure, you know, the resilience of the network is dependent on the weakest node in that network. So all nodes have to be strong. Similarly, in shipping, you know, it is an interconnected system. There has to be interoperability between countries. So as a part of global system, I think if Korea's participation will be very key, you know, for example, in shipping, to actually strengthen the global infrastructure system. And I've just given the example of transport infrastructure. There is also similar thing on communication infrastructure. So I think that's one. So resilience of a global public good, which is a global infrastructure system across different infrastructure sectors. The second thing is that the application of technology, the Korean companies, the Korean engineering firms, they have a lot of expertise in building redundancy in the system, so that when unexpected, unmodeled, for example, uncertain events occur, there is enough resilience in the infrastructure system to actually respond in a manner that this thing. So, so while Korea has a lot of ROK has a lot of expertise in this area, you also have countries which are looking for this kind of expertise, and that's better provided at an early stage, not when the infrastructure is already in an advanced stage of design. So I think there is a possibility for ROK expertise to be deployed in other parts of the world where infrastructure development is more nascent. There are different kinds of risks. For example, small island developing countries, you know, where you know, a single airport is serving the whole country, and it has to be built to absolutely world-class standards, because you know that's the only entry port you have. So that's the second this thing. So how do we use ROK expertise to benefit this thing? The third is that there are some infrastructure sectors where as humanity we have relatively less experience, where the development is faster than the standard setting. So there, I think if we work together, then I think it could be sort of benefit to ROK in terms of ROK can be the net beneficiary of such technical expertise from elsewhere. So for example, if we sit around and see how, for example, we will build a resilience of systems such as elevated train systems to hazards of the future, hazards that don't exist now, but they are coming. You know, we're seeing the impact of climate change. So these are the three things I would say, you know, contribution to the global public good of interconnected infrastructure systems, using ROK expertise in countries that are at a nascent phase of infrastructure development, and number three, looking at, you know, new areas where we collectively have less experience and we can participate in collaborative work from which ROK can benefit itself. Your second question, Ambassador, about the environmental concerns. So also as part of CDRI, one area that we're looking at is really nature-based solutions. It is the current thinking is to really look at the green infrastructure. So a wetland, a well-preserved coastline, a mangrove is also ecological infrastructure. it's not, it is valuable. It may not be valued, but it is extremely valuable, and it provides services. So we have to look at green infrastructure and gray infrastructure, what we build with cement and concrete, in an integrated way. So if there are good practices from ROK, there is great experience from ROK. I mean, specifically, for example, you mentioned erosion, sea erosion, sometimes river erosion. I think that would be of immense value for many countries in the world, including our own. We have a lot of those challenges, and we would love to learn from ROK experience on that. So we can actually inventory such good experiences or such good practices from ROK and find specific areas where we can do that sort of matchmaking and come up with some collaborative initiatives. That would be incredibly valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. Let us take some more questions. Tani Krish, can you please unmute and ask your question?
Hi, I'm Tanya, student from GSIS Suwon. My question is how the disaster management handling the current pandemic issue, COVID-19 in India.
Thank you. Mr. Bhagat?
Hello, sir. Myself, Mukesh Bhagat. I am doing my undergrad from Banaras Hindu University. So my question is specific to Koshi flood in Bihar. Here, year after year, we read news of Bihar flood and the problem that it caused. So my question is, what are the main challenges that we face in Bihar, and why we are failing there? Thank you.
You can respond to these questions.
Okay. So the first one is, how is the disaster management system responding to the current COVID-19? So, of course, the lead for responding to COVID-19 is with the public health people who manage public health emergencies. But there is a large part of the response, which is what one could, in technical terms, one would call it non-pharmacological response, which is not necessarily just public health. So that is the area where the disaster management system of our country is responding. And what does that include? For example, not available in the public domain, but the whole application of risk assessment tools, looking at where the cases are, where the cases are turning into severe cases that are going to ICUs, plotting them district by district, and doing a risk analysis and looking at, how this is spreading in geography, and providing that input to district level managers so that they can improve their preparedness. That is sort of one thing that we are doing. The second thing is that while, in the context of COVID-19, a lot of economic activity had to be suspended for some time to sort of enable social distancing. The other disasters that happen every year do not take a break. So we've had 2 cyclones within a span of 2 weeks in May and June. We've had some chemical disasters. We've had massive floods. We've also had landslides. So how do we organize a response to these events in a context where COVID-19 is also there? So there are concurrent disasters. So this whole work of how do you revise your standard operating procedures so that you can minimize the impact. I'll give you an example. So before COVID-19, if a cyclone shelter in the coastal area of Odisha could hold 100 people, with social distancing, it can keep only 40 or 50 people. Even that will be a little thing. So where are you going to keep the other 60 people? So planning for that, repurposing other resources to make that happen. So all of that work is being done by the disaster management agencies of the country. And our disaster responders themselves, the National Disaster Response Force. So it rarely happens that when you are responding, the responders themselves are at risk. But this is a situation where they are at risk because they are going into communities where they're evacuating people to protect them from floods or cyclones, but there may be COVID-19 infection. So when the first cyclone occurred, I think it was May, I forget the date, about 100 NDRF personnel were infected. They tested positive from COVID-19. So we have to take care of our responders as well. The good news is that all of them have recovered, they're fine. But so it's a very complex environment right now to do even our regular work of disaster response. The second question on Kosi flood, that is a very difficult question. There are many different dimensions to it. One dimension is how do we improve the management of the embankments that are already there, and how do we do a forward planning of embankments? As you know, because of the high silt load of rivers emanating from Himalayas, in many places, because of the sedimentation, the river within the embankment is flowing higher than the outside. So if the embankment breaches, there is no way for the water to come back in and go out. So there is a whole category of things that need to be done on embankment management. On that, modernization is happening. The second is the issue of how do we work in a manner that we don't look at rivers in just political boundaries, but also have cross-regional collaboration to have information exchange on forecasts, etc., to have a better forecasting. So, I mean, one could give a whole day's seminar on many dimensions of Kosi floods, but I can say that things are improving little by little on that front, and much greater application of technology, much greater involvement of communities in planning the response now. Thank you. I see 4 more hands up, so let's take those questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Vel Kumar?
Thank you, ma'am. So thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question, sorry to be pessimistic, is there any specific plan or measure the global disaster management bodies to counter the future deadly pandemic?
Mr. Bhatt?
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Firstly, I want to thank you for your great session. Since disaster management is not my field, but this session helped me in relating my field with disaster management. This year, I am going to start my graduation with cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. So, in your opinion, how could artificial intelligence can play a bigger role in disaster management? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question.
So the first question, do we have a plan to deal with the future pandemic? So as far as the plan is concerned, you know, there is a national guideline for dealing with pandemic. It came out a few years ago. The National Disaster Management Plan has a whole section on who should do what in case of a epidemic. So that's there. And in terms of procedures, how do you do containment zones? How do you do social distancing? All of that has been done, even prior to COVID-19, and it has been used in COVID-19. But truly, COVID-19 is something, the scale of it, it would be fair to admit that we hadn't anticipated the scale of it. We hadn't anticipated the characteristic of it. So there are many lessons to be learned from it. In some ways, the way our system responded is a matter of satisfaction. The way we were able to scale, you know, there's a whole industry for producing the PPE kits, for example, from the production of technical fibers to their sewing to their distribution. Similarly on testing, similarly on production of ventilators. So there are some things where we can take some satisfaction, but we are right in the middle of it. It's too early to say anything with a final conclusion. We have to do a sober analysis of where we did well, where we could have done better. And certainly we will have a more robust plan drawing on the learning of what we are going through right now for future. I'm not pessimistic about the next pandemic if it happens. And the second question was about use of artificial intelligence. Yes, of course, artificial intelligence is already being used a lot in disaster risk management. There are many applications. You can use artificial intelligence to do flood forecasting in environments where the data on the conventional data is not available, and you use other proxy data. You see connections between different parameters. So we have a partnership right now with Google, for example, where on a pilot basis we're using Google's capacities in AI to do some flood forecasting work for Ganga. So yes, it's the future, but of course it's not a substitute for the on-the-ground understanding of the dynamics of how disasters pan out and what makes people vulnerable to them.
Thank you. Could we take two more questions again? Mr. Rohan?
Thank you, sir, for this fantastic lecture. Myself, Rohan Sawant, I'm a law student. My question is, sir, would you please enlighten us on man-made disaster in context of the Lebanon blast, which recently happened? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Natarajan?
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful presentation, sir. I am Durai Murugan Natarajan, founder, Trust of Union Welfare from India. Sir, my question is, what are the training to undertake disaster response on cultural heritage sites? I want to know about, sir. That is my question.
So thank you very much for those questions. The first question of what happened in Beirut. So on Beirut, I believe it was 4th of August when the blast occurred. The problem was that there was a lot of ammonium nitrate, which was seized from a ship. It was sort of illegal wherever, so it was seized by the authorities. And then it was kept in a particular place, stored for a long time. I think 5 or 6 years it was sitting there. And some work was going on in the site next to it without the awareness that this potentially explosive material was there. Ammonium nitrate has certain characteristics. If managed well, it can be, it can be managed. And the reduce eliminated. So since you are a law person, there is a very clear legal angle to it. Legal angle is that once a hazardous material is seized and it is kept in custody of somebody who doesn't know that chemical, who doesn't have the expertise, then whose responsibility it is to keep it safely? How do you make sure that it is not just kept till the legal issue is sorted out, but it is disposed of as quickly as possible? So there is a whole dimension of legal arrangements for managing hazardous material whose ownership is not clear. I think that is a key issue which basically led to this tragedy in Beirut. The good thing about ammonium nitrate is that the number of producers of ammonium nitrate are very few. Where it is produced, who's got the license to import, where it is actually being moved and used, all of that is finite. So it's not like, it's just everywhere. So it should be easy to actually track that and put in place a good mechanism to track where the material is, and at each level, people who are managing this are responsible and they know how to handle it in a safe manner, so that they are safe themselves and they keep the locality safe. In Beirut case also, the minimum buffer zone that you need between the storage of such huge quantities of ammonium nitrate and the population was hardly there. There was hardly any buffer. It was too close to population. So that's the first question. The second question is, where can one go for training on cultural heritage and disaster management? There are a number of avenues in India. One is IIT Madras has a heritage center. There is a professor there, Professor Arun Menon. He runs the center. He's an expert himself in this area. So they do training, but it is more for engineering interventions. It's not so much for response. We have Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management. They also do some trainings. We have Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. They also do these trainings. And the National Institute of Disaster Management also does trainings on these issues. So there are several avenues. And internationally, the Tsumekan University in Japan does a 3-week training. The selection happens through a competitive process. It's a 3-week training, and I hear it's quite good. Anybody can apply. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, I see 2 questions from our Korean friends in the chat box. One is regarding, the question reads like this: do you have any thoughts about Korea-India bilateral cooperation for disaster management at the bilateral and regional level, and also specifically on tackling the COVID-19 pandemic? And another one again from our Korean friend on COVID-19 pandemic. She says, as every pandemic leaves traces, how disaster management plans to handle post-COVID crisis?
So the first question, what are the areas of possible bilateral collaboration between Korea and ROK and India? Basically, I will outline, aside from COVID-19, I would outline 3 areas. The first one is in the area of resilient infrastructure, either bilaterally or as part of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. I think that would be of great value. I am aware of the kind of disaster risk management techniques, for example, in the shipping sector, the ROK is doing. There is a much that we can learn here in India, but also we can together work to disseminate that knowledge to the rest of the world as well, and particularly countries which have which are in a nascent phase of their infrastructure development. The second thing I would say is in the area of early warning systems. There is a lot of good work in ROK on early warning for hydrometeorological events, particularly in the context of a changing climate where the future hydrometeorological events will not be exactly like they've been in the past. So how do we work together to begin to predict the future, use science to do better prediction of the future and reduce uncertainties in our forecasts? The third is nature-based solutions. How do we use natural systems to reduce the loss of lives, to reduce the impact of disasters? For example, how do you use bioengineering to stabilize slopes, reduce erosion around rivers, reduce the runoff in urban areas? How do we do forecasting for urban floods? So these are the 3 areas. So Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Second is forecasting and early warning, particularly in the context of a changing climate. And the third is nature-based solutions for reducing the risk of losses from disasters. Your question on COVID-19, I think the second question also asked a similar thing, so I will combine the two. I see that in COVID-19, there are three things that we can work on. One is that, the whole area of, I will not get into the issue of testing strategy. I'm not an expert on that. But around that, the whole strategy for contact tracing, community awareness, how ROK has used technology to facilitate that, how ROK has used the community's leadership to facilitate that. So the whole sort of community side of things, some exchange of good practices there is one thing that I would see. The second is in the context of some understanding of how the private sector has played a role in ROK and have some sort of comparative exchange, because the scale of the pandemic is so big that no government can do it on its own. It has to take the private sector along, especially because private sector is increasingly a bigger player in the provision of health services. So I think that's the second thing, some exchange of experience on private sector. The third and a very important area, and where we have done some innovative work, which I didn't talk about in my presentation, is psychosocial support, both during the pandemic to those who are directly affected, as well as after it. So the psychological scars that this pandemic is going to leave on our societies, it has to be taken very seriously. So, and the number of people that need to be supported and to be reached are enormous. The whole characteristic, if I just took, basically, I would put it in three levels. One level is the psychosocial support to people who have tested positive and their disease has manifested at different levels. The second is psychosocial support for healthcare workers, and three is everyone else. So everyone, there is no one who's not affected by it. So how do we use both the modern psychosocial practices, psychosocial support practices, but also our cultural resources to actually reach out to people and address this issue? For the first category, from NDMA side, we have done something very innovative. As you know, we have a very large number of people who've been affected. So we invited back in May applications from volunteers who were trained in providing psychosocial support, like with formal qualifications. And we did an evaluation and we built a pool of something like, in the first phase, 50 people. And then we developed an app. In that app, using that app, these psychosocial counselors can call people who've been tested positive, and on both ends, privacy is maintained. So the caller doesn't know who they are calling. The number is not there. They know who they are calling, but they don't know the number, and they also can't return call. And provide on the phone, you can say psychosocial first aid. How are you doing? What are your challenges? It has been tremendously successful. Although we have not been able to reach, the full caseload of infected people, but people who we have reached, they've really come back to us saying that this is great. At least somebody called and found out how we were doing. So it had two benefits. One benefit was that they felt supported. The second benefit was for the system to get a feedback as to how the system, public health system, is responding on the ground and how it can be improved. So that psychosocial support is something where we can explore whether there can be some exchange of good practices, what we can learn from you, what is it that can be useful for you from our experience. Thank you.
Thank you for taking up all the questions. In fact, there are some more in the chat box, but I think it's already 4:30. So we'll try to wrap up now. Let me thank you on behalf of Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center at the Embassy of India, Seoul, for your time as well as your deep insights and also responding to all the questions. Some very, very useful points came up during the interaction and interventions made by the participants, such as identifying the areas of bilateral cooperation between India and Korea. In fact, that is the sole objective of organizing this lecture on a virtual platform. And let me tell you that we have participants not only from Korea, but also from India and from other countries as well. So that is one benefit that we have on this virtual platform. And indeed, it has been a learning experience for all of us. Thank you once again. And thank you to all the participants as well, and also to the team of Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center and Embassy of India in Seoul for all the technical support.